All right, good afternoon. This is Automated Account Creation from Sysdata. My name is Eric Rux. I am the Director of Information Technology for a school north of Spokane called the Riverside School District. And I'll let my partners in crime introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Matt Feiter. I am with ESD 101 up out of Spokane. I support several different districts, but we oftentimes do really small districts. And you'll kind of see how this fits into the districts I support, being there only part-time, sometimes like a half a day every other week. Try to set up some automation, and this stuff is really handy for me just because I'm not there all the time.
I'm Andy Jones, also from ESD 101. Same boat, Matt's in.
All right, so today is split up into basically 4 sections. We'll each take 15 minutes, and that should leave us 15 minutes for questions at the end. But if you have questions right away, feel free to shoot up your hand, and we'll do our best to answer. And if we don't know, we'll try to find out. So this is what we're going to discuss. I'm going to discuss how we're going to get the data out of Skyward. If you use a different SIS, a different student information system, the process will be similar. The idea is to get it to a CSV, and then Andy will take it from there to try to get it into Active Directory and other directory services. And then Matt will take over and really dig into some of those weird anomalies. What can we do when we have weird cases, kind of one-offs? He has a lot of those with the different schools that he supports, so he'll take care of that. And at the end, we're going to completely shift gears and not talk about that. We're going to talk about how to do single sign-on with Skyward, poor man's SSO. So first disclaimer, we have nothing against those really cool tools like Tools Forever, Umra. You see some other ones out there. We love those tools. Those are great. If you're using them, perfect. If you can afford them, great. If you're a smaller school and you can't, or if you're not automating, this is a great alternative. Really, really inexpensive, not difficult to set up. Got to set my timer. You got one? Okay, good. Again, we're trying to get the data out to a CSV. From there, we can then take care of importing the data. So here's the brief overview. We're going to extract the data out of Skyward. We're going to securely get it to our local network. We're then going to upload it to Active Directory and push it out from there. And here's kind of what it looks like. So again, from the student information system, how many here are using Skyward? Okay, what else are we using? Okay, so if you can get that data out to a CSV, you're good to go. Then we need to figure out how we're going to get it to our location. We'll talk about a few ways that we do that. The inexpensive software that we're going to talk about is Dovestones. Andy will dig into that and some other different directories that we'll want to get our students' accounts created in. And our goal is to never manually create a student account again. So never have that STEM teacher call up and say, Jenny got here a week ago, why doesn't she have an account, right? We want to eliminate that process altogether. What we tell our teachers and our secretaries is if you create a student account today, by tomorrow morning, she'll be all set up, ready to go. Now, if we need to push it, we can push it, but the goal is you come and register this morning with your mom at 9 o'clock. By tomorrow morning, you're completely set up, automated, no hands-on at all. So how did this even get started? So like you, I found myself one August with a big, long list of student accounts that needed to get created, and I'm thinking, I just don't want to do this. I've got to figure out how to automate it. And I remember that in our student information system, Skyward, we have really cool import-export features that I'm going to dig into in a minute. And I had that data in a spreadsheet, and I was looking at different tools that Microsoft have. They have some scripts, they have some tools they've created. There's a bunch of free ones out there. And I found this one from Dovestones. And as I was importing the students, I noticed this little tab here, Scheduler. And a light bulb went off. And I thought, wait a minute, I wonder if we can connect all these dots together. So it took quite a few weeks to figure out how to make it work. Ran into some problems, try to figure out how to troubleshoot it to make it work right, and now we have a system that we replicated, I'm thinking, well over 10 districts. from my area and the ESD that they use. And correct, DevStones. They have a lot of different software besides just this. Pretty neat company.
For that?
Yes, that is $199 for that. So out of this, let's see, if we go here, out of all of this, it's $199 for this. Everything else is free and or your time. So that's how we got here. And then what's been really neat for me the last, I think we've been doing this for 3 or 4 years, to see other administrators take it to the next level. So Andy and Matt, in their different schools they support, they've taken this to the next level. You'll see some neat things that they've come up with. So some prep, you probably aren't starting off with a school with 0 students. You already have students in Active Directory. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that the students that we create from our student information system to Active Directory are not duplicated. So we want to make sure the naming convention is the same. In Skyward, in this example, we define the login format. So for us, it's 9 characters of a first name, 9 characters of a last name, and then their graduation year, or whatever your Active Directory is. Make sure that matches. But again, you're not starting off from 0. How do we fix all those accounts in Skyward that are already created? Even if you only had a couple hundred students, you still don't want to have to fix those. Well, Skyward has a nice built-in utility. You can't see it up here, but it says mass generate student permissions passwords. And we just have it generate new logins. So in a couple of clicks, in about 5.5 seconds, all the accounts in Skyward are fixed. Now when we create accounts in Skyward, it's going to see that they're already there and not duplicate them. All right, so we are going to discuss the actual exports from Skyward. How are we going to get the data out, and what data are we going to extract out? If you want to do this, please email me. I will send you my templates. If you've worked with exports in Skyward, you know you get a nice little text file that'll get you 90% there, right? You'll need to change a few things, but it'll get you most of the way there. Just email me. I'll give you my email address at the end, and that'll get you started. All right, so each school or each entity requires 2 exports. How are we doing on time, Andy?
You're at 7:30.
Perfect. So one, we need basically to create a shell account. So if the student does not exist, we create just the basic part of an Active Directory account. We set things like the default password, their name, that sort of thing. And then we run an update. So the update gives us the description, maybe it's their grade, puts them in the correct organizational unit, puts them in the correct classes, puts them in the correct groups. Maybe we have a student group and a Gmail group. That's what the update does. And then when they move from the elementary to the middle school to high school, every day when this runs, it doesn't create a new account, it just skips it because they already exist, but it runs that update. So it moves them from 6th grade to 7th grade, from the middle school to the high school. So it'll change their groups, it'll put them in the new organizational unit structure, and you don't have to do a thing. Every August, as the secretary moves them from one entity to the next, it just takes care of it in the back end. So hopefully that isn't too small, but this is the export, the big export, the update that we do every day for every single student. I'm going to break down a few of these, but you can see we're exporting the names, first name, last name. We're doing things like adding them to groups. Yes, go ahead.
Now, are all of those required for AD?
No. Only about this many are required for AD.
So why the long list then?
So we do 2 exports. Great question. We do 2 exports. One, just to create their shell account, just to get them an account. And then we add as much or as little as you want. So, for example, we want to map their M drive and map it to a specific file server. If you're not doing that, you don't need that. But if you do, it's there. Same with groups. So we're adding them to a Gmail group and a students group. Again, it's entirely up to you.
Where you want them in Active Directory, what OU you want them to go to,
Okay.
things like that.
So what's required is, I believe, just SAM account name. I don't think a whole lot more is required. So here's this blown up. So here's just some examples. Notice that as we export out of Skyward, we're changing the heading of the CSV file. And these map directly to what are those?
Attributes.
Yep. Actually, that was an audience question.
I thought you couldn't.
Thanks for your support, Andy. So those are Active Directory attributes. One neat thing about the DovStones software is it does not require a specific order that the columns are in, just that the column names are correct. So it will take care of that import for you. So any Active Directory attribute you want to populate, export it out of Skyward and just change that heading. Employee number, we grab the student alpha key, and Matt's going to discuss that a little bit too, how handy that comes in. Those of you familiar with databases, the primary key, that comes in really, really handy. So here's an example of concatenation. I had to get the word concatenation in here sometime. So when we create the shell account, we say in the description, user created on that date. So this helps us in troubleshooting. If we're looking at a user account that cannot log in or doesn't have the right information, we can look in Active Directory and see, well, this shell account was created yesterday, but it was never updated for some reason. So that's just a little bit of troubleshooting help that we've added there. And then down here, this is the destination organizational unit where that student's going to live. And I'll show you how we generate this data based on the student. How are we doing on time?
11.
All right, perfect. So again, there's that student alpha key. We put it in the Active Directory employee number. And then I want to talk about the account enabled. So this allows us to enable or disable the student account based on when the secretary activates or deactivates the student account in Skyward. So this is a pretty cool feature of Skyward. When the student is or active in Skyward, we're going to, on the fly, change that data that gets exported to the CSV file to true. So Active Directory account, active, true, and then inactive to false. So we all have this where the student leaves to go live with dad for a week. The secretary sets him to inactive. His Active Directory account gets sent to inactive. And then he decides he wants to come back and live home with mom, so he comes back to the district. Secretary re-enables his account or reactivates it. And then that night, it gets reactivated in Active Directory. IT isn't even called. We don't even know that happened.
And that triggers, that can trigger a Gmail account as well?
Correct. So as the Active Directory account gets activated or deactivated, and or as it gets moved to a different organizational unit, Andy will discuss that, and then Gmail will activate and deactivate. So again, the secretary inactivates the student. At 4 o'clock, everything rolls downhill and gets deactivated on their computer account. Some schools do it 2 or 3 times a day. We've been okay with once. And then here we're using that same field, which one? The active or inactive, to move them to a different organizational unit. So we set the account to inactive, and we kick them out of the Riverside Elementary School or OU and put them in the all-disabled organizational unit. So it cleans up Active Directory on the fly. When they move from middle school to high school, it moves them out of that one organizational unit into the new one. When they come back, it moves them back. And we schedule it for whenever you want. Schedule that CSV file to come out. Perfect timing. So once we have the CSV file exported out of Skyward, we have to get it to our local network somehow. So I use FTP Voyager. That is the only program, the only free FTP server I found that has a built-in scheduler. So it is able to pull that data out. Again, something else that these guys have taken to the next step, they've now have Skyward push that FTP file to their district instead of a pull. So just more efficient. But somehow you have to get it securely, right? Because there's PII in that file. Securely get it to your network. And with that, I'll hand it over to Andy Jones.
Yes, I do. All right. So, whether you're pulling from Skyward and CSV files, a local database if you host your SIS, however you have the data, now that we have the data, we use that to create the Active Directory accounts and to create our Google, Microsoft 365 accounts, so on and so forth. A couple of things shouldn't have to remind you of, but I should remind you of. Eric just talked about how there's some sensitive information in here. Make sure that wherever you're storing that, not anyone can get to. And then if we're using multiple programs to do this, so just make sure you've got the timing correct there. Like your SIS pulls before your Active Directory scripts run to create accounts. And then after Active Directory runs, then you can run your Google and Microsoft services here. So we kind of had a few options doing this. We kind of went with a blend of 3 and 1. If you wanted to just do basic stuff, we bought the Dovestone software, which I'll go over here in a second, just because it's got a GUI, it's supported, fairly inexpensive, $200 for just the both AD tools. The whole suite is $300, and it comes with some more tools that I'll show you. PowerShell, we always do that. Well, if I get hit by the truck rule, if I get hit by a truck, can someone pick it up right where I left off? So yes and no if you train someone else, but we thought that the hard cost, or the soft cost, excuse me, of someone creating all those scripts, it was cheaper for us to just buy a $300 piece of software. So $299 was scheduled. That's actually for the whole set of tools. It's worked great. This is actually a screenshot of an older version. They've added a lot more functionality in there as well. These are just some of the tools it comes with. The main one we use here is AD bulk tools. Grabs the CSVs, converts them into accounts for us, just runs scripts on the back end. Some other neat tools that come with this, you can do things like go scan your Active Directory for computers and accounts that haven't been used in a long time. So AD kind of cleanup tools. Eric talked about this a little bit. We take the CSV file and those attributes we set up. We'll pull out of Skyward. We might need to map them a little bit, change the heading on them, which you can either do straight out of Skyward, or after the fact, if you just wanted to pull a really basic report from Skyward, you can use PowerShell to add more attributes as you go, and Matt will go over some of that stuff. So we typically split it up into 2 processes as far as when we add and modify accounts, just because when we add the accounts, we can put something in the description like, oh, this is a newly created account, so as we're going through troubleshooting process, why didn't this kid's account get created, or why didn't they get moved to the right OU? And then we modify all the users. This is, we add extra attributes. So those 2 CSVs we pull out of Skyward have different information in them. So this is where we add detail to them. We can move them to different OUs. So as they get moved in the SIS to a different school or unenroll, it'll disable their account, move them to a disabled OU, or add any information, name changes, things like that. Updating accounts here. Things to kind of watch out for in Skyward, or as you pull the data down, if you have names with spaces in them, hyphenated names, O'Brien's, right? Things that we typically fix either in the export or with like maybe a PowerShell script before we run the automation tool on them. So these are just some gotchas here. Not very often we run into them, but occasionally you'll see them. All right. So we've got the Active Directory accounts created now by running those scheduled tasks. Now, this is a tool. Who here uses this currently? Good amount of you? Perfect. It's free. It's a tool that Google gives you. And we'll talk about actually these 3 things here. But essentially, you just set it up locally. It queries your Active Directory and then creates, disables, moves accounts as you set it up. So obviously, you have to have G Suite, right? You can't create Google accounts if you don't have G Suite. I recommend doing G Suite password sync and getting that installed on your domain. That way, if we typically set it up, if a kid wants their password changed, they need to do it at school on Active Directory. It pushes that change up to Office 365 or Google. Remember, this though is a one-way service. You can't change your password in Google and have it change your Active Directory account. So that's part of why we have it structured where kids they forget their password, go talk to whoever the designated password changer in the building is. Once you install it, it just runs as a service, and kind of set it and forget it, update it during the summers when new versions come out.
Have you thought about going to student password reset, self-service?
Yeah, I'm not going to go into detail on that, but I list that as kind of an option. I'll show you what we use in a few places, but they do have some self-service options as well. First screen, obviously you said this is one of the districts I work at. You either set up a service account or use one of your Google admin accounts to authorize the domain. There's always going to be a few accounts in Google that are not in Active Directory, or when you run this tool, you don't want to get disabled. So I have a group of like non-Active Directory users. They're just Google accounts that they're just in there for a specific purpose. Or if you have accounts that aren't in Active Directory, again, you can either specify by everyone in an OU or specific users there. Hooking it up to your Active Directory is pretty easy. Essentially, you will do something just like this. Give it some credentials. Connect. Pretty easy. Straightforward there. I talked about how we typically do organizational units, OU structures. Where do you want kids to be in Google? Where are they at in Active Directory? User accounts, obviously. Groups we typically use so we can manage our distribution lists in Active Directory and not in Google. So if we need a teacher added to, or kids added to certain mail groups or Active Directory groups, we can sync those up to Google as well. On this one, when we set this up, or at this particular example here, I already had a separate OU structure in Google than I had in Active Directory, so I click that checkbox up top. If you don't click that checkbox, it'll essentially replicate your Active Directory structure to Google. So I didn't want that done, just the way that our filter works there and how we move kids around. So I actually went in here and you can map, like if they're in this OU in Active Directory, send them to this OU in Google. Common gotcha. If you set this up, you're running, and then summertime rolls around and it just breaks. As your kids move from one building to the next or into different OUs, it'll actually kill the process unless you go, this is set at default, I think 5%. So every summer, if you have more than 5% of your students moving to different buildings or different OUs, it'll basically just fail. Send you an email that says that it didn't work. So for emails, typically, if your domain email is running the same as Google, you can just put your mail in there. If, for instance, you still run on-prem Exchange, or you have a different domain for your staff emails than what their Google accounts are, you want to use something besides mail. So you can set it to employee. There's a list of attributes this long. Type in what their Google account email address will be in that field up there, and then it'll create those accounts with that field. Always set it to suspend accounts, not delete accounts. You don't want to delete a bunch of accounts and have to go undelete them. And then obviously that's just a fail-safe kind of at the bottom. Don't deactivate our admin accounts. This is where we try to generate unique passwords for everybody. So we'll either generate something out of Skyward or pull something out of Skyward that's unique to that kid, but something that's common enough for them to remember. It might be a combination of like their lunch pin or one of their student ID numbers. So what you can do is when you pull that data out, just put it in your like employee ID field or some other attribute. And then when you create new accounts, it'll actually set the same default password for their Active Directory account, their Google account. They don't have to reset their password to set their password. Obviously you don't have to sync your entire Active Directory, so we only do basically our school OUs and our staff OU there. So this is when I was talking about mail groups, this is how we have it set up typically. If someone's a member of that group in Active Directory, we want them to be a member of that group in Google as well. It's pretty simple. Go create a group in Active Directory, add your members to it who needs to be on that list, and you're golden. Of course, we don't want to go in there and have to run this every day, so we automate it. It's pretty simple. Command line, put it in your task scheduler. After your Active Directory account process runs, run your Google account process. Now we Microsoft. Okay. I will say we don't have a ton of schools on how many Microsoft Office 365 schools do we have? Okay, handful of them. We don't do a ton of this. Most of the schools we work with are Google schools, but we have set this up in a few places. The biggest thing we run into is like if someone has a .local domain or their Active Directory domain name does not match the domain names that they're using in Office 365. Microsoft makes you add a DNS suffix inside of Active Directory and set those to match your domains in Office 365. So that's probably the hardest part about the Microsoft one. We use a tool called Azure Active Directory Connect, free again, and essentially it just syncs the accounts and allows kids to log in with their school credentials. It's Microsoft, so of course it's going to be a bit more complicated. Before you do this, definitely go read this doc and figure out which way is going to be the best for you. We are on a limited time. We don't have time for that today. So we'll keep it pretty short and sweet. I'm just going to show you what it looks like sort of after you set it up. It's actually a really quick and easy wizard you run through. And then it just sits here and kind of runs every so often, syncs accounts, password changes, all that good stuff. And just like in Google, you can tell it what you want to sync, specific OUs. We do that because if we move someone to an OU that's not synced, we want their account to be disabled. We don't want their Active Directory and Google account to be disabled but still have access to everything else. For other applications, Clever. We won't dive deep into this. Who here's using Clever? Probably a lot of you guys. Yeah. You can even log into Windows PCs with Clever badges now. I don't know if you guys knew that. So. But it all ties together because if you're like logging in with Google accounts to Clever and their Google accounts disabled, they're not going to have access to this stuff. The password changes, we talked about it. So one of the common things we do is either principals, librarians, secretaries, we delegate control in Active Directory. This is one of the tools we like. It's called Password Control from Wisesoft, I believe. If a kid forgets their password, they can just go to the office and either retype in their password. Now all their passwords are changed, or they can reset it for them. So, of course, we only give them access to the students in their building. So, there's also self-service options. Once again, a little bit on the time restraint there. So, as a final result, from once we pull data from our SIS to get it going, essentially. Secretary creates a kid's account. The next day they come in, they have access to Active Directory, Google, Office 365. When a kid gets inactivated, they leave the district, get moved to a disabled OU, gets disabled, everywhere else gets disabled. If a kid comes back, it'll see that it already has account. The kiddo already has an account created, move them back in, reactivate all their accounts. So. Same with moving them back and forth between places. So now I'm going to pass it off to Matt, and he's going to show you some of those unique challenges and also how to do some of this stuff in PowerShell if that's the way you'd prefer to do it.
So I did run into several different unique scenarios. I was kind of handed some of this, as they've talked about so far, but I was running into some scenarios that we just couldn't handle. One, sometimes you run into limitations in the report writing inside of Skyward or your SIS tool. And you just need a little bit more power to it. So I added some PowerShell back into the mix here, but I'm also really careful to kind of what Andy already hit on too, kind of the hit by the bus rule. I don't want to leave something for somebody else to support long term. As I already mentioned, I also run into another scenario where not only the bus, but I also got to make this simple enough if I have a teacher technician on site that they can support it. As I mentioned, I support 5 different districts, so I am there just part-time, sometimes 1 day a week, sometimes less, sometimes more. But what we try to do in this is so far you've seen that we export out a CSV file from the SAS tool, and then we use Dovestone to do all the complexities with Active Directory. One of the functionalities of PowerShell, if you guys haven't gotten into this, and I'm trying to convince my team too, that you shouldn't be scared of PowerShell. It's got some really cool capabilities. One of the capabilities that I would put forth in here is if you're simply doing string processing and or CSV manipulation, it's extremely easy and it's easy to read through. You don't even really have to comment a lot of the PowerShell. Effectively, you can see that I just import a CSV file, and then I just run basically a for each on every row. One of the really cool functionalities in PowerShell is if every column has a header in it, it actually automatically creates a variable sequence in there for you. So you can see that I reference things like row.sam account name. I never created any of that. It just automatically came in as part of the CSV. Down here, I'm switching on the department. I happen to use the department field for class. So if I have class 1, 2, 3, 4, those are my grades through my school. So all of my grade 1 go into my elementary. All of my grade 2, same thing. And so I have just a simple switch statement, simple if statements, very simple PowerShell scripts that I can work on this type of stuff, but I can get a little higher level of logic than I can out of the reports inside of Skyward. I've also been able to, one of the districts I support, Davenport, we ended up having 6 different scripts out of the SIS tool. And I was annoyed at making the same change to all 6 of those. And so what I ended up doing was getting down to 2, like we've talked about, just a new creation and a modify. And then I put all the knowledge in here instead of having those multiple ones out there. So it just made it more simple for me to support long term. Kept this very simple, so someone downstream or the teacher technicians that might help edit some of this can do so very easy, because it's just really copy and replace and some simple blocks. So as I said, the logic's just too simplistic. I'm just trying to do something a little bit more sophisticated. But I work in some unique challenges. So one of my most challenging districts is I work in 2 called Wilbur and Creston. They happen to be in consortium district. So I've got 2 SIS instances. I've got 2 physical locations and 2 separate Active Directories, all combined into one Google domain. And so I have to make the exports out of each site. Well, and I'll talk about that here more in just a little bit. But there's some other things that you might want to consider too. I've seen some cases where you might want to make grade-based groups. So have a group, an email distribution group for all of grade 7, or so on. And so I can, again, with the logic inside of PowerShell, make that happen very quickly. Dovestone, one of the features that it has is it has the ability to import in a groups column. And all you have to do is just have I think it's comma-separated list of groups. And so it's really easy for me that as I'm processing down through here, I can just add a group name into that comma-separated list, and then now all of a sudden that user gets added into those groups. And so I can very easily do a lot of different groups that I want to dynamically create as part of this. I can handle some of the exceptions at the PowerShell level. As kind of already been mentioned, there are some special characters, spaces, and or hyphens that cause complications. I can handle that here a little bit more powerfully than I can within the SIS exports. We also have some unique challenges, and I'll share an example here at the end towards usernames and passwords. Some things stay the same, some things just always change, right? So we're constantly in this mode of trying to say, where something came from and how we get to that next step. And I'll use an example where I ran into some of that with username and passwords. Effectively, I've already said a lot of that, in that I just feel you have a little bit more power at the PowerShell level. So effectively, all I do is the sequence of events that we've been talking about so far. You export out your raw data, SFTP it somewhere, and then you add this PowerShell step. In my case, with the consortium district, what I do is I actually export out SIS1 and SIS2 to the same district. Then I run PowerShell scripts on all 4 of those files because I have a new one from each one and an update from each one. I import everybody into Active Directory 1. Then I take those files over to Site 2. I reprocess those because obviously I'm going to have a different domain. I'm going to have a different OU structure possibly. But those get processed again and then put into AD again. What I'm careful of is I only do the Google imports from one site. So with Wilbur and Creston, I've got an elementary middle school and then an elementary high school. So the most complex scenario is a kid could start in elementary here, go to middle school here, and then come back to high school here. And so far my scripts are handling those types of scenarios as I walk through that. But I want to try to create all the kids in both schools so that if they're at either school for sports or any type of event, because there's a lot of shared events, they can log into either domain with the same username, same passwords. So that's kind of where I'm coming from that complexity side. So other ideas you might want to add into there. I create some of my IDs with logic. So in the case of Wilbur and Creston, one school had previous names of first initial, last name. The other one had first name, last initial. We kind of decided, well, we didn't like either of those ones, so actually what we want to move to is first initial, last name, and then grad year. So I was able to, again with PowerShell, spit out all this information once with the reporting tools, import that in, and as Eric mentioned earlier, there's kind of an important thing you have to think about here, and it's a primary key that exists throughout this entire scenario. So one of the things I did was I exported out once the primary key to kind of be around their usernames. But as part of what we do is we usually use an employee ID field, which is actually the employee ID in our SIS tool, which is capable of being a generic, or a primary key there. I try to use that same primary key in Active Directory. So what I had to do first is I had to marry up the primary key with the usernames in that folder. Then I was able to actually switch my primary key that I use from the usernames to that primary key that's really there. And I was able to actually change their usernames. And all on the fly, we actually decided to do this, not ideally, but we did this in the middle of the school year. So I was actually able to do this on basically a Friday. Kids went home having logged in as the old username, and then when they came back in on Monday, they were all under the new username schemes. Traditionally, I'd like to do more of that over the summer. It's just we didn't have the opportunity to do that in this particular case. So it did help me, though, because in my particular case, since I'm generating a lot of these with logic, I didn't have to answer the marrying of data between the two systems, between Active Directory and the SIS tool. We're going to do that part of it over the summer here, so that when we get down to Eric's stuff here, you can do a little bit more. But we had to do this to support Google AD and some of the infrastructure between the schools, and we'll come back to the SIS tool and marry that up later. It will be nice because long term, we'll make the decision of the username there. I still run into collisions on occasion, and so I've had to handle some of the collisions as exceptions and work with those. In some cases, we've also changed passwords. We do have some grades that still use generic passwords, and one case we were using them K through 5, and we wanted to make that change and go K through 3 instead and actually do individual unique passwords. Again, I was able to do that very conveniently with PowerShell at any point in time. You also, another thing that you can get into too is it's a really good idea if you do use Office 365 to assign users to groups, because you can actually auto-create your licenses on Office 365 as long as you're members of certain groups. And so again, that's another beneficial place where you start using some of the groups type stuff to actually auto-assign Office 365 licenses. And then any sorting you need. I've got some schools that for whatever reason sorted out their Active Directory by grade level, and we wanted to go more just a middle school, high school type concept. So we were able to migrate a lot of old content to new structures, again, which is using these data files. So as I mentioned, Wilbur and Creston had different username schemes. Well, in addition to that, we also were moving from on-prem Exchange to Google. We were also moving from 2 completely separate domains to 1 domain. And again, I was able to do all that through these types of tools and this data set. And so we were actually able to change their usernames, as I've already described. We were also able to take their old usernames and their old domains, add them in as an alias field, which some of the stuff that Andy showed you notice that we can set a primary email, which is actually the username in Google. We can also set alias domains or alias emails so that they can continue to get email at those old addresses as well. But again, I do a lot of manipulation with just different Active Directory information in their Active Directory attributes, and then send it through to Google. It's just really nice because the Dovestone product makes it really easy to interface there, and I keep all of the complexity out of my code. So, and effectively, this was prep for converting to Chromebooks. They kind of made a last-minute decision. I think we were in there the week before school started and said, hey, we're buying Chromebooks. We need to get accounts set up. And I'm like, great. So I've got about 2 weeks to do that. And so we actually did it, like I said, in the middle of the school year. And it was pretty successful. I think we got everything up and running. But it's just kind of an easy way to add some content in there. And Eric's going to finish it up, changing a little bit to SSO but using the same data source.
All right, so the first 3 presentations we're talking about identity management, right? So creating accounts, identity, totally shifting gears now. Not talking about that. Now talking about authentication, and a little bit of authorization. So Skyward districts. Okay, so for the rest of you, apologize, but I think you'll like this. So how can we use our local Active Directory to securely authenticate our users? So instead of having multiple usernames and passwords, just have the users use their Active Directory username and password. So first, got to give credit where credit is due. I did not come up with this method. I actually learned it from South Kitsap School District. Is anyone from South Kitsap in here?
Used to be.
Used to be? So do you know Derry Lyons? I've spoken to him on the phone but never met him. So
Very sharp guy.
yes, very sharp guy. If you would like this PDF that Derry wrote, I'd be happy to send it to you. You wrote it back in 2014, and it looks like it was written by Google or Microsoft. It lays out exactly how you need this to work. I've taken it a few steps further and added a few enhancements, but he gets credit. He's the one that came up with this, and he learned how to do it from Skyward. They have a nice white paper that I can also send you if you're interested. So what are we trying to do? We are trying to have our users log in with Active Directory credentials. Then we have to securely get across the internet back to our Active Directory, see if the user is authenticated or not, and then give that information back to Skyward. Most schools in Washington State do not host their own Skyward. With SIPC, a consortium hosts it, right? If you hosted your Skyward on your own member server that was a member of your Active Directory domain, this would be a no-brainer, because by essence of being a member of the domain, you're in the Kerberos realm, you're good to go. It just works, right? It's secure, it's fine. But that's not the case. How are we going to get our credentials back across the internet without everyone seeing our password in clear text? So we do that with an Ssl certificate and some other things. All right. So the first thing we have to talk about is how are we going to tackle the Ssl certificate issue? So the first thought is you can roll your own. I'm sure you've all rolled your own certificates before with your own CA. That works great. It's perfectly fine. It's free. Doesn't cost you anything but your time. The challenge is that you're going to have to copy your public, not your private, your public certificate to a SIPC. That works great, but I have heard stories specifically from South Kitsap that sometimes with SIPC forgets to copy your public cert to a new server when they spin one up. So we didn't go that route. Did I skip a slide? So we did not go that route. We purchased a cert from a CA. It's only a couple $100, and it allows with SIPC to use your publicly available public cert to secure that data. So you don't have to communicate with SIPC. You don't have to worry about them kind of forgetting to copy your public cert. And this is what it looks like. So with SIPC's here, they're using your public certificate to secure your data as you send it back to your domain, using your private certificate to decrypt it, right? So even if someone else has the public cert, they're not going to be able to decrypt your data, only if you have the private. And then on the firewall, we also limit it to only allow connections from the SIPC Skyward servers. So if someone is going to try to get to your domain controller through the firewall, it's being blocked at the firewall at the IP address level. All right, so if you don't have a whole lot of money and you want to combine certificates, so kind of a sidebar, there is this concept of a subject alternative name when you buy your certificate. So you can have a certificate with one name, and then you can add multiple 5, 10, 15 other names to it. So you can have one certificate that can service multiple host names. So the next thing we have to do is make a decision on name resolution. So option 1, send your IP and host name information to a SIPC. They'll put it in their host file on the server. Works great, but with SIPC has control, and again, if they forget to copy the host file to another server, you're kind of stuck. The other option is just to add A records in your public DNS. Allows you to be in control, but now your read-only domain controllers can be name resolved from the internet, right? But we put Where'd that go? But we put IP address filters on our firewall. So again, someone may be able to resolve the name, but they're not going to be able to get to your domain controllers unless you're with Ssl. Sorry about the order there. All right, so unless Skyward has updated Skyward this past weekend and moved this, well, they'd like to move this one, it should be under configuration, Ldap configuration. Again, I've seen people try to do this. Hey, we'll just click Kerberos and we'll be good to go. That doesn't work unless your Skyward server is on your domain as a domain member, right? Because then you're part of that Kerberos realm. But you're not. So we're going to use Ldap S, which is Ldap over SSL. And there is our name resolved name, so RODC1. And there's actually 3 columns. There's a third column here, so you can have 3 domain controllers, have a look at 3 different domain controllers. This section down here is not needed for simple authentication. This is used for authorization. So, South Kitsap does this, we don't, but this is pretty cool. You could have a teacher security group in Active Directory mapped to a teacher security group in Skyward. So instead of having separate Skyward security and separate Active Directory security, you could just set it all up in Active Directory and have it roll. Pretty cool, but with the new version coming out, I'm not going to mess with it. But it's there, but you don't need to fill that out. Gives you a nice test login. What's the one problem we have with trying to set this stuff up is when it doesn't work, I don't know why. This gives you some nice testing, and it gives you a nice log right here telling you what the problem is. Can't find the server, bad password, whatever. So here's a blown up picture of it. Again, Ldap S, and the domain, and the unresolved domain name right there. I like this feature. All Ldap users are allowed to use their Skyward password. That is good as you're in transition. So if the usernames do not match Active Directory yet, and you don't want to block everyone from logging in, you can still allow them to use their old Skyward password. Once you get everyone moved to Active Directory authentication, you can uncheck that box. And then, again, you want to leave this one unchecked. Enable Ldap for guardians. Otherwise, you're going to create Active Directory accounts for all your parents, which you don't want to do, right? So some things to consider. So you want to have the Skyward, the Skyward and the Active Directory names have to be the same format, because when you ship the name from Skyward to your Active Directory, it has to match. Just like the previous presentation that we did a couple minutes ago, there's a utility to mass change those accounts. And this is important. It's not a password sync. So we talked about using the Google tool and shipping your password from Active Directory to Google. That's not this. This is more SSO or SAML, if you've ever done SAML, Microsoft's direct federation services. It's more that kind of concept than it is a password ship. And that's the last slide. Any questions for all 3 of us? Yes, and I'm going to hand this to anyone who gets asked a question.
Can you only do students?
Yes, I believe so. Yes, right here. So enable all that for students.
Are you talking about account creation or about?
No, if I wanted to allow my students to log into Skyward, the way that my system is set up, their Skyward login is the same as their login to our Active Directory and everything. Right. But my teachers are not. They have numbers on the ends of their logins for their Skyward logins, and I don't mess with it.
So the question is, can you separate it and just have employees and not students, or just have students and not anyone else, or just have guardians on anyone else? And the answer is yes. So you can be just employees, security users, just students, or just guardians. And I never do guardians. But this is an old screenshot. I actually have students enabled now. So I do students and employees. I do not do guardians.
I think my staff anyway has a good grasp on logging into Skyward and everything.
Any other questions about any of it?
Have you guys considered, so in my role as Amplified IT, running into more districts or stop putting their students into AD? period, because
Right.
they're pretty much one-to-one. All they have is a PC lab, something like that. If you guys consider down the road, maybe you won't be able to use Google Cloud Directory Sync, but if you guys are experts at PowerShell, you could link that up with GAM or something like that to create the accounts.
So, me personally, I've been a Microsoft guy for 27 years, so I didn't think I'd ever say this, but I think in my district, Active Directory's days are numbered. For me, the last hurdle, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, is authenticating PCs to Google. I heard that's coming.
Secure Ldap that just came out with, so you can use a third-party client to point to Google as the authenticator, as the directory service.
So I would love to do that. Again, to simplify it.
Right.
We just deployed a bunch of Chromebooks to high school, getting ready to do it to junior high. I cannot imagine deploying those as Windows PCs to those students. It was way easier with Chromebooks. So I think Active Directory's days are numbered in my district, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, it's coming. I just, with your guys' expertise, it looks like you'd be able to figure out GAM pretty easy to run a cron job or something to complete the process, because you're going to be skipping, you're going to export that CSV, you use GAM to grab that CSV and then create the accounts.
Yep.
Yeah, it's something we've thought about, but not quite there yet. Coming down the road.
We also have seen a lot of competing things because Microsoft offerings are getting a little more competitive too, with the addition of like Minecraft in O365. And so I have some, in some ways it might be easier to keep Active Directory just to do the Office 365 integration piece, just to support Minecraft. So it's going to depend on where the schools kind of go with the technology they have.
One of the things that helps is I can't take credit for it. I had a friend help me who does identity management. I now am able to authenticate Office 365 using Google Directory. So on the Chromebooks, you can now use Office 365 as a button, and the authentication SAML just passes right through and works. So not another username and password for the students, it just works.
So what about going directly into Google then from Skyward?
Exactly, and that's what he was mentioning. Yeah, I think we could potentially get there to have one less thing to manage.
Yeah, I think the purpose of this class is how to do this pretty much on the cheap, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Least cost. There's tools out there that can skip 80, but keep it on the cheap, in-house scripting, things like that is what these guys are doing.
And we wanted to kind of show a framework. So your scenario is going to be different, but this is kind of a framework that can help you get going in that direction. Any other questions?
To get your emails up there one more time.
Sure.
Yeah, is that the best? Just email you and ask for all the info?
Sure. If you're a Skyward user, I'm happy to share my templates with you. That'll get you heading in the right direction, get you 90% there. You'll need to change your organizational unit path, right? But everything else will be pretty much the same.
So where's that doc? Where's that?
If you email us, he's going to add our email addresses there. And then, so on the Skyward export, instead of creating it from scratch, I'll give you my template. It'll get you 90% there.
IED?
Yeah.
Here's Eric Dodra.
Correct.
Or
Correct.
Get those lines out of the way for you.
Make up bigger?
Come on, Andy. Any other questions? All right, thank you. We're happy to speak with you on one-on-one if you want to come up. So thank you very much for your time.